Well, now, this is the season when we really lift up our prophets of the church. And the idea that God is speaking through people, as well as through creation, about things that are to come. And prophets are people, generally speaking, who know how to listen. They listen with their eyes as well as their ears. And they listen with their hearts and allow their hearts to be touched and moved into speech. And in the power of the word that created all things, prophets bring us a very important kind of word that's intended to stir us up. One of the prophets, and we just heard from the Old Testament, is Jeremiah. Jeremiah was quite fond of stirring things up. And the way he did that was to basically tell people how they needed to do things better. Now, if you're like me, when someone comes along, no matter how nice they are, and they're trying to tell me how I can do something better, it can take a little bit of a spiritual shift, a psychological shift, so that you can be open to hearing what they're saying. Now, add on to that Jeremiah's particular personality for which he was known. He was not particularly nice to people about what he was saying. And it seems like the prophets in general were not, because they were mostly overlooked and dismissed. And indeed, Jeremiah was so known for bothering people so much that he was once arrested and put in jail so that he would shut up, or at least the people would get a break from all the ways that Jeremiah was telling them that they needed to be better, especially those in leadership. Well, Jeremiah, who speaks to us in this first Sunday of Advent, his words here are actually not gloomy. They're not gloomy at all. So something odd is going on. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And in those days, at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. And in those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. So, where is he saying this? He's suddenly extremely positive, and he says this amazing pronouncement actually at the very moment that Nebuchadnezzar is about to seize Jerusalem. And he's standing on the steps of the temple by himself as others flee, and in the face of certain devastation and destruction, he sings a song of hope. He sings a song that proclaims that God will send a Messiah, and that a day will come when Jerusalem is saved and led by its true king. And he says this proclamation in the face of an earthly king that would take away everything that the people knew and loved. Now, that's a very different version of hope than Hallmark cards. Hope you have a nice Thanksgiving. Hope that your dreams come true. This is a hope that is kind of spawned from courageous faith in the face of utter destruction. A hope that is God's hope, and the prophet speaks it at a time when the people deeply need to hear it, because they are in ultimate fear of being overrun in such a violent manner by this king who would come and take away their world. Now, here we are, entering a season of Advent, being reminded of Jeremiah's powerful hope. And it is a time in our nation and in our world where we need to hear this hope again, don't we? We are confronted by times that seem extremely and are extremely tumultuous, that are essentially challenging many nations to the core of their identity and their values, what they believe as nations and what they hold dear, irregardless of what people may believe about God or not. There are fundamental beliefs inside of us that have developed in our national histories that are now calling forth from us the best of us in our response. Because here's really, in the face of violence, really the thing that is the greatest enemy. It is not so much the one perpetrating the violence as the fear that can develop inside ourselves. That fear can cause us to do the very things that make us betray our identities and our values. Fear stirred up in us can cause us to abandon, as the hymn said, all reason and all ability to reflect. And as Christians, if we act out first in fear, and we act in fear first, we have, in a way, abandoned the very faith that we say we hold dear. For in the face of great challenge, Jeremiah stands and remembers to the people that God has made them a promise, and that God will be with them. Now, in the early community of Christians, we had from the Gospel Mark that we heard last week, and Mark being the earliest Gospel written, is written closest to the time after the destruction of the temple. And in those days, the first generation people who experienced that really could not even imagine what their future would hold. And faith became even more important to hold them together as a community of believers, even as they were exiled from their homeland, driven into captivity. They came together around beliefs that they were able to piece together from what they had been forced to leave behind. And that faith continued to sustain them. Now, Mark writes as though the signs of the coming of this Messiah are related to the destruction of the temple. And his hope, I think, is that the Christian community would have an experience in their lifetime of Jesus returning to them. It seems very clearly that the Christian community really felt, again, a very literal belief that when Jesus said to them, "I'll be back," that they thought that was going to be really soon. But again, as in most things, the Christian community has to take some time to understand what exactly is going on in the legacy that Christ has left his followers. What is it that is going to be fulfilled? And certainly for Luke, Luke writes about 2 decades after Mark does. And for Luke, by then, the generation that has come up is basically no longer asking the question, when will Christ return? But they are asking the question, how? How will Christ return? What has to happen for that? And so Luke combines this really interesting set of images for us. He creates a sense of chaos in terms of the signs and the wars and people's fear. And then he follows that right up with, like the trees. Jesus had said, like the trees and the leaves on the fig tree. You know when summer's coming because you see this new life come out from them. And isn't it interesting that we have both things side by side? But isn't it also generally true that for new things to evolve, that often takes a very painful process of social and personal transformation? The experience of literally dying to an old self or an old way of being and thinking before a new identity can take its center in us, and we can let go whatever constrained us before in order to become more fully what we are called to be. This kind of collaboration or partnership between destruction and new life is even seen on the slopes of volcanoes in cities that have known natural disaster that are gradually restored into new life. We see it time and time again in the cycles of creation. And so we ought not to be surprised that it is a cycle of human social life. Many of you know that in one of my previous jobs and incarnations in this life, I was a cultural anthropologist. And in my studies of ritual, which I think are really key in the way that any social group or society begins to point to and name its identity and its goals. Ritual. That's why I value liturgy so much. Because ritual, liturgy, when well done, provides a creative and safe place for us as vulnerable people to encounter a powerful God. A God that in these moments of engagement would change us far more radically than we might ever want or be prepared to receive. Now, in kind of these rituals of transformation of self, known as rituals of initiation, there are many kinds of groups and societies that as they indoctrinate young people into becoming adults, they will literally take them away from their families and kind of put them in what we might call a retreat setting, but they're taken away from society. And basically their entire self-understanding is shaken up through ritual. All the ways that they used to know themselves are sort of literally stripped from them. And through a series of teachings and liturgical action, they are made adults. And the society now refers to them as adults and has expectations for them as adults. In some ways, our society's kind of lost touch with some of these transformations. So when we hear such words as destruction followed by new life, those things can seem a little foreign when we talk about them in terms of ritual. But how important that they are. Because here's what I think Luke is getting to, and what many theologians take away from Luke, which is he was talking about a time between what is life like for the Christian community, what is their identity, from the time after Jesus dies until the time he returns. This idea of Alpha and Omega. We're living in these in-between times. And it's lasting a lot longer than Mark's people thought it would. And the question becomes, well, what will it take for Christ to be with us again? And I think if we can consider the world and our human societies as being in a time of genuine transformation, a time of liminality in cultural anthropology, when everything seems both chaotic and striving for new ways of being together. That this is an opportunity, actually, for us to understand a reordering of both how we think of society and our relationships with one another, a reordering of how we think of our relationship to creation and to God, a reclamation as well as innovation of all the different ways that our values inform us and how will those empower us going forward. Because certainly the world will look a lot different if we can make that promise of hope a lived reality in the face of violence, destruction, and despair. Hope, the way Jeremiah practices it, is truly transformational and becomes the lifeblood, sustaining the people through times of uncertainty. The when of Christ will return. Many of our Christian brothers and sisters pick up on the images of devastation and destruction as though they welcome war and chaos, because surely that means that Christ is near. But I believe they miss out on the next set of symbols, which is the trees, the new life, the branches. Fig trees have to be cultivated by people in order to be productive, as do most fruit trees. Fig trees are some of the earliest trees to put forth their new shoots. That, I think, is the sign and symbol that is given to us, that even after experiences of destruction and chaos, God promises us new life. And our hope must be a radical hope, committed to transformation, away from violence and towards compassion, away from destruction and committed to rebuilding a world that will be better in a way that prophets and God and Christ has asked us, chided us, commanded us, invited us, kicked us in the behinds, and loved us into being. Our hope must be one of great courage, especially in darkness. And in this time of Advent, we are invited into ever-deepening mystery. And in the midst of social chaos and the occupation of the Roman Empire, God calls upon a young adolescent girl and says to her, will you, the least powerful in all your culture and society, be the vehicle by which God will enter the world? In Advent, God makes the same invitation to each of us. Will you be the vehicle by which the power of